Okay, welcome back everyone. For our last session today, we're going to have another conversation piece, this time with Dr. Signourney Bonner, who's just become a doctor a few days ago. So congratulations.
Thank you.
That's a practical application of the encouragement we were hearing about earlier.
Yeah.
So we're just going to have a chat, get to know you a bit and find out a bit about what you do.
Yeah.
So firstly, just tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? What does an average day for Signourney look like?
Yeah, sure. So, as mentioned, I've literally just finished my PhD as of Thursday. So I work, so I'm now a postdoc, actually in the same lab. So I work in developing new models and therapies for a rare children's brain tumor. So a lot of my time is spent with mice and analyzing data, doing survival studies, that kind of thing, and really just hoping to develop new treatments for this rare children's brain tumor. A lot of my work is, I'm really grateful to be able to be at Cambridge in a really well-funded lab, which gives me opportunity to use lots of different modalities in terms of data analysis. So I do lots of single-cell sequencing and proteomics and things, and thinking about big data and how we can integrate that to kind of pull out really meaningful data that we can then use to treat children in the clinic. So most of my days look like sitting at my computer, designing experiments, having conversations, and collaborating, particularly being on the Cambridge Biomedical campus. There's lots of pharmaceutical companies, biotechs, so meeting with people and just getting to talk about the best ways that I can do my science and be the most impactful that I can be.
Excellent. So what inspired you to go into science in the first place, though?
Great question. So I know that there are lots of scientists who are like, oh, when I was a kid, I just loved being in front of, like, just in the mud and looking at all these things. I was not that kid at all. I was the kid who wanted to be a pop star, et cetera, et cetera. And my mum was like, you should probably also think about something else. And I was like, all right, fine. So I was good at science. I enjoyed it. I hadn't really considered it as a career. And then kind of as my mum was like, oh, like, what else have you been thinking about? And then I kind of was like, actually, I think I want to be a doctor. And I wanted to be a clinician for a long time. I actually wanted to be a pediatrician. And then God kind of moved some things. It was probably also down to me. So I got into medical school, but I missed my grades. I went and retook some A-levels, and then when I reapplied to medical school, I actually didn't get in. So I was like, all right, I will go and do human physiology, because I still really enjoyed learning about the body, and was like, okay, cool, I'll do that, and then I'll go and do graduate medicine. During my first year, I spent some time in a lab, actually working in neuroscience and spinal cord injury. And the moment that I sat in front of the microscope, having done an experiment that I knew nobody else had done, and I got to be the first person in the world to see the outcome of this experiment, I was hooked. And then I was like, this is what I want to do. I don't want to prescribe drugs for a lifetime. If I make one drug in a lifetime, I'll have so much more impact. And that's just really what led me down that path. And I hadn't considered PhD or anything like that. Didn't even know what that was. Don't have any scientists in my family. Didn't have any contact with anyone like that. But just fell in love with it and just followed the passion and what I felt God had called me to.
Cool, yeah. Following that passion and that calling, I think, is a good thing for driving yourself further. Just a note to say that in physics, it's possible to be a scientist and a pop star if you dream enough. So anyway, in your career, you've done work in academia. So we've been talking, in Nathan's talk, especially we were saying about being an academic scientist, but scientists go beyond academia, and there's a lot of us in industry as well.
Yeah.
So what are the differences between being an academic scientist and being an industrial scientist? What did you find?
Yeah, so I have worked for a few pharmaceutical companies. I did a year in industry during my undergrad. a Japanese pharma working in their neurodegeneration department, and then I worked for Pfizer for a year in neuroscience and pain, and then I went to work for AstraZeneca for 3 years in oncology. So I spent a bunch of time in different pharmaceutical companies, just for context. And actually, I think that those journeys really helped me in transitioning kind of what some people would say backwards into a PhD, in that I guess we talked about like holding things lightly. I'm able to hold my science really lightly, and I am not so committed to a hypothesis that I will continue to drive experiments down this path till I prove what I already think is right. I get to hold it really lightly and be like, well, if it doesn't work, no problem. I'll do some other experiments just to be sure. But if it isn't, I'm really happy to let it go. And I think that industry taught me a lot of that kind of mindset, because I was working on so many projects, and sometimes it would be like, oh, okay, yeah, I know you've been working on this for 6 months, but they've closed the project now, so round up, writing up those experiments, and we're done, you've got to move on to something else. So it helped me to hold those things really lightly, and then coming back into academia and working with different models and different experiments, I was able to hold those results really lightly and then not be so like, well, this didn't work out the way that I expect, therefore it must be wrong, not I must be wrong.
Would you prefer academic or industrial research?
Ooh. So before I started my PhD, I was like, oh, I'm absolutely going back into industry. I'll do this and I'll bounce back. Now I'm like, oh, but academic freedom. And just being able to just pick up and answer the questions that interest me has been really great. So I'm now kind of like, there's a bit of a balance between those things. And in some pharma companies, actually, the level of academic freedom you have is a little bit more. But I am, for now, currently enjoying just being able to follow my science, follow my interests. So I think I'll stick in academia a little longer and see what happens.
Are you able to still work with industry as well from within that?
Yeah, so through the work I'm doing, I have some industry collaborations, so that allows me to kind of dip into some of those. So I have a collaboration with AstraZeneca, so I get to nip in to their kind of new headquarters in Cambridge and chat with them. I also used to work there, so it's kind of easy for me to walk in and have conversations. But yeah, so I have a good chance for industry collaborations and pushing my work more translational and further towards the clinic, which is encouraging.
Excellent. And so just taking a side step to this side away, is it really away?
Yeah.
How did you become a Christian? How did that come about?
So I had grown up in faith. I went to a really, really tiny family church up until probably I was like 13, 14. And yeah, I'd just always been like, yeah, Jesus, you know. But actually there were some things which in reflection, I realized that I wasn't taught. So I knew Jesus was there. I knew that I could pray, but I didn't have what I would probably deem a relationship with him. I wasn't necessarily reading my Bible. So it wasn't really fostering that level of connection. But I believed and I thought that that was fine because I wasn't really taught about salvation per se. So I was like, all right, fine. And then some things happened within the context of the church, and my family left. And then I just kind of was like drifting, and I still prayed and kind of went through, as we talked about, spiritual disciplines, but I wasn't really, again, I was just kind of floating about. I went to university, did my undergraduate still, and then actually I had a lot of questions, as I'm sure many of us do as scientists, are like, well, why do you believe? Like, that doesn't make any sense. You won't be a scientist and be a Christian. That doesn't make any sense. And that actually kind of shook me to my core. And I realized that actually my faith was really shaky. And that was really hard. And I kind of just was like, I don't really know. I think I believe, but I'm not really sure, and questioning. But then I moved to Cambridge, started working. And then during that time, this is so random, I went to a bar and I met somebody who was like, oh yeah, like I go to church, da, 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 da. And I was like, okay, sure. And he was like, I'll give you the details. So I then just went one Sunday, and it reminded me of my family church, and I kept going. And then that was when I fully discovered Jesus for myself. And that was when I fell in love with who he is, as opposed to living through anyone else or through other people's testimonies. And it's just, yeah, my love for him has just grown since then. So it's been an up and down journey, but yeah, more passionate about Jesus now than ever.
Does that relationship and that passion change how you approach your work, what work you're interested in? So you mentioned you work with mice, so that's animal testing.
Yeah.
That's potentially a controversial issue for many.
Yeah.
So is that affected at all? And the other way around, does your work affect your faith at all?
Yeah, so in the kind of thinking about ethical things, it's definitely been a question that I've asked myself, but I've also had conversations with other scientists and thinking about the fact that God gives us things to be able to use for his glory. And I do believe that we have an ethical and a moral obligation to take care of the things on the earth. And some of those things include people and developing treatments. And if we didn't have to use animals, I wouldn't. And I still treat them in the best way that I can, and trying to minimize suffering and all of those things. So I think I have peace around that decision. And then when it comes to things like how it affects, or how my faith affects the way that I approach work. So because I work in children's brain tumors, there's a lot of developmental biology that I look at. And some of that information isn't work that I do, but I know that it is sometimes questionable, and I do sometimes feel uncomfortable with is not we as a lab, but other labs who do this work use tissue from medical abortions, for example, and that's something that's been quite tough for me in working that through and trying to understand where God wants me to sit in that space. So it's not something I personally do, and I haven't had to answer the question and make those decisions for myself. But I know that in the field, it's something that's done, and it is something that I'll probably have to really have a conversation with God about and decide where I fully stand on that. I know that, for example, my boss is a Christian, and he says that we will not use human tissue in our lab from those types of procedures. So yeah, some of those things do come into impact, and I do sometimes think, well, if I went in another field of science, I absolutely wouldn't have to answer this question. I wouldn't have to think about this. But sometimes that's not what God calls us to do. He calls us to seek him and be brave and get those answers to those questions from him so that we can walk in integrity and faith. So sometimes it can have an impact, yeah.
It's good to deal with some of those questions sometimes rather than just pushing them aside.
Yeah.
It's how you grow a bit more.
Yeah.
So apart from the kind of the ethics issues you're talking about, have there been any other areas of faith and science that you've struggled with or been confronted with that you might find difficult, and how did you resolve those?
I actually don't think the other parts I found particularly difficult. I think it's been the more that I do science, the more that I understand what's happening in these cells and molecular mechanisms, the more I'm like, oh, he's definitely there, because I can't see all of this in all of this order and be like, oh, but it just happened by chance. That doesn't sit with me. It doesn't make sense to me. So I think actually the more science I do, the more I have what feels like personal evidence to say, oh no, you're definitely there, and you're definitely in the midst of this.
Excellent. Just going back slightly, what did your family make of you going into science if there's no science background or no academic background?
They were like, go for it. We don't have a clue what you're talking about, but sounds good. And then when I said I wanted to do a PhD, they were like, well, let us know what that is, and then we'll go from there. Because obviously they knew, like, a medical doctor. And I was like, you'll still be able to call me doctor. And they're like, great, that sounds brilliant, go for that. Can you get a job out of that? Yeah, brilliant, go for it. So that's kind of been the experience. So my parents were overjoyed on Thursday when I was like, I'm actually a doctor now. They were like, yes, finally.
Yeah, well, when I got to that point, my parents said, no more degrees.
Oh.
Get a real job.
I think because I had a real job in between, they were kind of okay.
I did as well. Oh. I think they forgot. Don't know, you're also the CEO and co-founder of an organisation called Black in Cancer. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I founded the organization in the midst of 2020, really because, you know, I've talked about my experience. I had worked at a bunch of different pharmaceutical companies. I'd done my undergraduate degree, and I had never met anybody who looked like me with a PhD in all of that time. And for me, visibility is really important. And I always tell the story of when I was a kid, my mum was asking me, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And at one point I was like, I want to be an air hostess. She was like, why do you want to be an air hostess? I was like, because I really love being on planes. And she was like, okay, but like maybe think about something else too. And that was, you know, my lead down the science route. But a couple of years ago, I said to her, like, do you remember that conversation? She's like, yeah, of course. And I said to her, well, why didn't you encourage me to be a pilot? And she said, oh, I just didn't really think about it. And for me, that was the power of visibility. It wasn't, oh, there wasn't somebody who directly looked like you, so you didn't think you could be it. It's just so subconscious that it's like, it didn't even come into her head, because I was like, would you have been proud if I was a pilot? She was like, absolutely. But it just didn't enter into her mind. So for me, it's the power of visibility that enables us to just see what we're able to be. And it's not that it's impossible, but it is harder. So what I wanted to do was to create a community for young Black researchers that they could see what they were able to be, what they were able to aspire to. And on the flip side also, I wanted to think about the wider Black community and thinking about how could I help them to be informed and empowered about their healthcare decisions. They have poorer outcomes almost globally when it comes to cancer mortality rates. And frankly, it's unacceptable. So what I wanted to do was, if I can't make an impact directly on each person being diagnosed, I can at least help them to be equipped to ask the right questions, to get the right information, to be able to advocate for themselves in those spaces so that they do get the best care possible, because that's what everybody deserves. We deserve to be treated equally. So yeah, that was what started, and we started that virtually in 2020, and we had some social media like weeks where we had lots of talks and things, and it's really just grown from there. So now we are an international organization based in the US and the UK. We had our first conference in 2022 in partnership with Cancer Research UK, and we had 250 delegates come from a number of countries across the world to talk about their science. And actually, next week, we're having, in partnership with the US government, our second conference where we have 400 people coming to talk about their science, to build community, to network. And yeah, it just keeps growing. And I know that God's been in the midst of it, because doing that in the midst of my PhD, it has been His grace alone, honestly.
Yeah, it sounds like it's keeping you very busy.
Yeah.
That's some fantastic growth and numbers involved there. So growth in itself can be a challenge. What other challenges are going on as well for the organisation? What's next for it?
Yeah, so in terms of growth, we're really trying to make sure that, because currently there's a lot to do, but there's actually only 7 of us doing it. And we all have, nobody is full-time. Everybody is either a postdoc or they're an early career researcher. So really it's about continuing to grow, continuing to establish the connections that we have and the support, and making sure that we can further reach out into our community and make sure that they are getting the information that they need and seeing the impact of that. I know that we are continuing to grow our mentorship program. So we have had 80 students who majority have gone on to do masters and PhDs, which is just incredible. So we're hoping as those continue to grow, that they continue to pour back into the organization. And as we have kind of titled our conference, Lifting as We Climb. So helping, bringing other people up as we continue to climb up the ladder too.
Yeah, that's very important to be bringing up that next generation along on the journey as well.
Yeah.
So you're busy with research in industry and in academia. You're at church. Yeah. You're running Black in Cancer. Yeah. So what do you do to relax? Do you have time to relax?
Borderline. So I guess it depends on what relaxing looks like.
What do you do to have fun?
What do I do to have fun? I like to take a holiday. That's usually my vibe. I'm like, look, get me away. Let me explore somewhere new. Let me explore God's creation. Spending time with friends, that's really important. And honestly, also having godly counsel around. I think certainly the last few years, I've seen God really move in terms of placing people in my life who are able to pour into me in a godly fashion, who are helping me to, whether that's refine skills, give encouragement, all of that kind of stuff. And honestly, just equip and expand my capacity. So that's been something that I've really been working on, and also trying to understand where God is like, you don't need to do this anymore. It might be good, but it's not what you need to do right now. And being attentive to listening to that and having people around who are helping me to refine that has been really important.
Yeah, kind of recognise that before we get to the amputation stage.
Yes.
We were hearing earlier.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for people who are maybe in the earlier stages of their scientific careers, what are your top 3 tips on how to succeed, but also how to find the right balance between life and work?
Yeah. I think my biggest piece of advice would be, and I feel like it's so generic, but it's like you really do have to listen to what God's calling you to do, because sometimes it's not what you expect. I think often, especially when we have people around us who are like, you're good at this, go do that. It's so easy for us to be influenced as to the things that we're good at, but is that what God's calling you to? And I think sometimes it's about spending time with him and being like, God, what is it that you want me to do? Where is it that you want me to have an impact for your kingdom? And being okay with if it's not the thing that you thought it was going to be. And I can say that from experience. I applied for PhDs out of my undergraduate degree. I spent 5 years between my undergrad and starting my PhD. And I was like, God, where are you? Like, this is what I want to do. And like, you're just not here. And I now know that he was saying, it is all in my time. And if I can see the way that he has aligned all of those things, I wouldn't have been in the church that I'm in. I wouldn't have met my husband. I wouldn't have the community that I have. I wouldn't be now leading a ministry at my church had I not been in this position at this time. So I think it's trusting in his time and listening to what he's called you to do. And that's quite a big one for number one. But probably also resilience. It's not always an easy journey. We've spoken about how the academic journey is not easy, and balancing all of that is not easy. But there is so much that he has given us for us to lean on, that he will bring you through it. And finally, enjoy the gifts that he's given you. He's called you to this for a purpose, for a reason. There is kingdom impact that you can have. So just go and do it the best that you can. In all things you do them for the glory of God, and that includes every single facet of our lives, not just being in church. So those are the probably 3 things that I would say.
Fantastic. I think that enjoyment aspect is something we often forget in our busyness.
Yeah.
So it's good to be reminded of that.
Yeah.
So we're often told by people that science and faith don't go together, or well, you can't be a good scientist and a good person of faith. But
Yeah.
what would you like people to know about being a scientist who's also someone of faith?
Yeah, I think that, there's a couple things. One is, I feel like people often think that unless the Bible says this specific thing, then, it's not true. And I think that people outside of faith need to recognize that the Bible is not a science textbook. It's not there to tell you the science, it's there to reveal God. And in the same way as the science that we do reveals God in so many ways. So I think that it's not about doing science to disprove God, it's actually seeing God in the science. And I think that that's something that's really, when you lean into that, you see so much more of God in every facet. So I absolutely think that they can go together. Otherwise, we wouldn't be at the point at which we have scientists who are of faith. We're actually not a tiny community. We probably just are so afraid of the non-faith scientists that we probably just don't speak out enough. We recently started a prayer group within our institute, and actually you're seeing all of these like Christians come out of the, I don't want to say out of the woodwork, but realizing that actually there was way more than you thought. So I think it's not as uncommon as we make out. There are a lot of Christians who are also scientists who believe that God has called them to that, and they see God through their everyday science. So I don't think that they're worlds apart. I actually think that they're right on top of each other.
Yeah, fantastic. So maybe we need to, in our environments where we're placed, to stride a bit rather than just keeping our heads down.
Yeah.
So my final question to you is, you seem to be where God wants you. You seem to be very active and doing lots of good, but maybe what's next? What's coming up? Where's God maybe calling you to?
Yeah, I think that's a question that I'm still asking, actually. I think that I think that he's not calling me out of Cambridge right now. And what that looks like, I have no idea. But I am just open to listening and being like, where do you want me to be? What are you equipping me for? Where can I further equip myself for what you've called me to? So right now it's just a big learning journey. My husband and I are about to take on to be the head of the young adults ministry at our church. So just leaning into that, leaning into the community there and pouring into them and, letting them know that they are more than able to live a life of academic and faith, and that those can go together. And I think trying to live out an example of that, especially in a city like Cambridge. Yeah.
Brilliant. You're not short of things to do.
No, always busy.
So I'll just open it up to any questions or comments from the audience. Yeah.
Cheers. You can go first.
Thanks, Signourney. Thanks, Dr. Bonner. Really appreciate that. I know you've mentioned in Black Cancer that in some Christian communities and some churches, there's a lot of negative stereotypes and attitudes to cancer. I just wondered if you could share a bit about what they are and what we as Christians in our churches can maybe do to help change stereotypes or attitudes to cancer inside our churches.
Yeah, and I think that that's a real big issue. I mean, I've actually spoken to a pastor who had prostate cancer, who, from members of his own congregation, told him that he wasn't praying enough, and that's why he was in that situation, and that he shouldn't take the chemotherapy and that he should continue to pray. And I think that just those things are so problematic, and I think when we don't speak as, we talked about speaking about our faith in the science world, we probably also need to speak about more of our science in the faith world, so that we can let people know that this isn't evil, this isn't going against God's design. Yes, there is an incredibly important place for prayer, but there is also people that he has placed in these places to do the work, to provide the treatments for people, for them to continue to live out their purpose and their calling on this earth. So I think it's about letting people know that there is a place for both faith and science, and that taking medication does not eliminate God, and vice versa. And I think that that's something that's really, it's a real challenge in the church, in people being told that it's one way or it's the other, and it's really not. God has equipped us as scientists to do the work, to reveal his design, to generate new treatments, to give us the wisdom and the knowledge to then be able to develop these treatments. So he's in it all. And I think that we need to further communicate that to our congregations.
Hi, I really like that, just a note, I like that part about kind of not being hasty with rushing into a calling. So I thought that was really, really nice. My question was to do with your work in industry with the pharmaceutical companies. I have very limited knowledge in it, but they tend to have quite a bad rep, kind of like lawyers. So I'm curious, like, was there any, not animal testing, but any ethical considerations around kind of the general cultural practice of what they're trying to achieve? Was certain, like sometimes you hear in the news, like this research was covered up because it would be profitable, but not too profitable. What was your experience kind of with that?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So I think and it's different at different levels. When you see the scientists who are on the ground doing the experiments, designing them, their heart is for the patient. And that's so clear. And they're like, let's design this experiment, let's think about blah, 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 blah. But then I think the challenge is when a project progresses to higher levels and decisions have to be made as to whether that goes into the clinic, driving clinical trials, there are then financial decisions that have to be thought about. And that's where some of the challenges come in. And particularly, I mean, for me, working on a rare tumor, that's then equally as difficult because it's like the populations are so small. How much impact is this going to have? What's the balance? So you do understand both ways. And, you know, on average, it takes $1 billion to generate a drug. So they're going to want to get some of that money back. So you do understand it in some ways, but there are some things where I think if we had more of a holistic view and we weren't just thinking about the finances, but we were also thinking about, but these are still people. I think from a Christian perspective, these are still God's creation, and we deserve, like, just because they have a rare tumor doesn't mean they shouldn't be treated or that we shouldn't develop treatments for them. And there's a lot of lobbying within whether that's the rare cancer community to do things like that. But yeah, ultimately there are financial decisions that are made that you're like, I know, I understand, but also those are still lives, those are still people, those are still families. So yeah.
No, that's massively helpful, and that's probably true of every organization.
Yeah. And true of research funding, right? True of grants when we think about, do these even get funded within research labs?
Yeah, very true, thanks.
Question online as well?
I think it was pretty much the same as that one.
Okay.
When you're researching cancer, both my parents died of cancer. Lots of people do. I think 50%, more than 50% get some sort of cancer.
Yeah.
It's very prevalent, and it seems to be inherent in the world we live in.
Yeah.
How is that compatible, speaking as a Christian, and I'm a fellow Christian, with the world that was very good, quoting from the Bible, when God made his creation? Do you see that as a slight problem? It's hardly perfect if we have the very cells that make us up, the very dust that makes us up, actually corrupts against itself and reproduces. That's the nature of, I'm not a biologist, you can see,
no.
but it replicates, and it shouldn't be doing that because cells have to die. Yes, I'm talking theologically here, but how do you make that compatible? I'm sure people may have argued a God that allows cancer, which is the very cells that we're made of. It's not an outside agency. Well, I appreciate the corruption of those cells might come from an outside carcinogenic or whatever. That is a problem. I think cancer's, the big C word, is a major stumbling block, maybe. Have you? I'm sure you've thought about that.
Yeah, actually, it's funny that you say that because it's a conversation I had the other day. And I think that when we think about the fall and we think about how the world was changed as a consequence of that, a lot of things happen because of people and the way that we don't look after the world. So we think about things like lung cancer, and if we as people had taken better care of God's creation, actually maybe we wouldn't have so many pollutants in the air. Maybe we wouldn't, and those things all have an impact, and a long-term impact on the earth and us as creation within it. So I think that a lot of the things we think about when we think about disease, etc., sometimes we don't think about the bigger picture and the fact that we, as a global community, sometimes can be more concerned with ourselves, certainly those who are more financially rich, are more concerned with, okay, how can I get more money versus how can I make this sustainable? How can I take care of the creation that is, that is the earth, and then the impacts that has. So I think that's kind of where I stand on that. Is there are some things that I probably couldn't explain, things like tsunamis, etc. But I mean, realistically, a lot of these things are down to decisions we took as humans that we thought were good in our own eyes, and they weren't. And had we stayed in line with God's perfect creation, we probably wouldn't be in this position.
So you don't think the actual change in, sorry, as you mentioned the fall, I didn't bring it up, but I agree, I know, we all know the story, or stories. Yes, I sort of want to think philosophically there was actually a change in nature. It was perfect. But I think most scientists, Christian scientists I talk to, say, no, it's just the way it is. And yes, I totally concur. Mankind has corrupted everything. And tsunamis, they happen. I don't think there's much human agency. Don't go on a beach where there's going to be an earthquake zone within 20 miles. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Don't build your city near a volcano. Hey ho, or on an earthquake zone. Yeah, but people weren't aware of that. Of course, I mean, in my industry, buildings, people were putting asbestos in. Good for stopping fires, but caused mesothelioma and other cancers, bad news. And there's a whole industry taking the damn things out, So yes, I totally concur. I still think underlying, we do not live in a perfect world. Yeah. Very good is not perfect. No. Maybe not this side of eternity. Just one question on tumours. Yeah. Particularly in the brain. What happens, I know this is way beyond my pay grade, but I'm just thinking these are living, because cancer can go on living a long time, can't they? There's a woman in America, they took some, and it's still living, isn't it? I can't remember her name, but what is there any cognitive thought going on in these cancer cells? If you cut them out, what cognitive thoughts are going on? Okay. Or is that maybe something you haven't explored? But I just always wondered, these are living cells, and you're cutting them out of someone's body or killing them. Is there thought?
So actually a lot of, it really depends. So within the kind of tumor community, we have to think about where these cells come from and which cells are being what we call transformed into tumors. And often they're not, so you have tumors in the brain, for example, the type I work on, actually it doesn't switch from being a neuron, which is, typically the cell type that is communicative, etc. It actually comes from a much earlier cell type. So things like neurals, so they're basically stem cells. So we have small populations of stem cells that sit in all of our different organs, help us to, when there's damage, regenerate, etc. Or help to facilitate injury, like fixing. So specifically, if I'm thinking about the type that I work on, it's caused by these early stem cells that would normally differentiate and become a neuron, which would then be part of your cognitive process. But actually it transforms before then. So before it's got to that cell, what we call maturity. So does that make sense? Yeah. So it, no. Yeah. Yeah.
If I can ask a second question. I was thinking about what you were saying about human tissues from aborted fetuses. One thing I've sort of come to appreciate about God is that nothing's wasted. With him. And Jennifer Doudna, who got the Nobel Prize in 2019 for CRISPR, said that her attitude to ethics with CRISPR changed when someone put it to her, maybe we'll get to a point with this technology where it would be more unethical to not use it to alleviate harm and to bring healing than it would be to use it. Is there a case for okay, you have this tissue from aborted fetuses that is otherwise going to be destroyed, but you can use it to alleviate harm and to bring healing. Is there maybe a case for that as a Christian? I'm sorry if that's a horribly offensive question to people.
Yeah. No, and I think that that's a good point also, and has been one that I've thought about. And I think that there is a case for that. I think that there is a case for nothing is wasted in the kingdom. Yeah, I think that's all. That's kind of all I have to say about it. There definitely is a case for it, that God can use all things for His glory. But it is also heartbreaking on the same to the same end, you know.
And there might be a difference in intentionality. So the decision to use material that somebody else has decided will be aborted is different from deciding to abort someone in order to get the tissue.
Yes. Yeah.
Everyone asking 2 questions. So I was curious, my background was computational chemistry. So this is probably where this comes from. I was curious what you kind of just speculative, like let's say kind of 50 years, and with this current movement of kind of AI, bioinformatics, where do you kind of envision this kind of research, you know, going in a couple of decades? Have you thought about that, and what do you kind of envision?
Yeah, no, we do a lot of AI within our lab, and actually there's been a lot of talk about developing essentially avatars for children with tumors. So if we have all of this data from children's brain tumors, from normal developing brain, can we use that to say, oh, in these children, if you have this aberration, what might happen during development using AI, and then being like, okay, if you have then all of these genes that then change as a consequence, can we then use some of those as a drug target? Can we think about early intervention, blah, blah, blah. So I think that there is a really good case for that. But I think also on the flip side, there's just, as much as there's a lot of information, there's still not enough information, or we still don't understand quite enough about it and the complexity of it to really draw any true conclusions. And actually, we had a really good discussion about this yesterday, which is sometimes we get so caught up particularly as biologists, on one particular thing. Oh, it's this gene that does this, it's this protein, when really it's this huge complexity and network of things that actually, can we really, like, will we get to the point where we can think about designing a drug that targets this, this, and this, or do we have to give 15 drugs, but actually they all have off-target effects? So there's definitely a lot to be said about then how we utilize that information to create something that's effective and has less harm than anything else that we currently have. So I think there's definitely a role for it, but I don't know how that plays out to translating to the clinic.
You don't see like a cancer revolution or something happening in the next few decades?
I hope that there would be one. I don't see it.
Yeah, so can we just thank Signourney as we wrap up? I think getting into those questions, we could have several more talks from you, I think. There's loads to unpack there. So just as sound comes up to close for us, just to say, if you want to take some food home with you, there's still some food available. So I'm sure that Anne and Janice, who've done an excellent job in the kitchen today for us, will be happy to wrap up for you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm just going to formally close the event in prayer, and then, yes, you're welcome to mill around and take the food. Okay. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to be here and to hear from these wonderful people sharing about what you've done in their work and their career. And I've been so encouraged, and I pray that as we go away and think about and absorb so much of what we've heard today, that you will speak to us even more and encourage us more in our own research, our own journeys, and in our own questions. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Thank you so much for coming to Holy Trinity Aylesbury today for this conference. Hope you've had a great time, and have a safe journey home, everybody.